Thank you, Steve. And I'm excited to be here again for the second year at HackFest, talking about what I think is really important information. And I'm going to walk you through kind of a story-first presentation and talk a little bit about things that I've learned over my career and how that's influenced my perspective on product security testing and supply chain attacks. So let's go ahead and I'll start with the obligatory introduction of who's the crazy guy standing in front of you. So I've been in the industry for about 16 years, mostly on the offensive side of things. Have done a little bit of defensive as well. As Steve already gave the introduction, I got the pleasure of writing a new SANS course that launched this year, Security 568, focused on product security testing and supply chain attacks. If you like some of the content that you see in this presentation, some of it is taken from that class, so I would love to see you in one of my upcoming runs. I'm also lead a team at SonicWall doing vulnerability research. We also provide the content to the firewalls on a regular basis. And you can find me on almost any social media platform at Full Metal Packets. And if you're willing to scan a QR code of a former hacker, you can. That's my Linktree QR code right there that you're welcome to use. Okay, so to get started, obligatory need to define the space that I'm talking about. And I think interestingly enough, most people understand the concept of software supply chain attacks, but there's a nuance to the definition that is sometimes missed. So software supply chain attacks can actually be broken down into two main categories. One is what I like to call the breach-based supply chain attack. This, as an organization, you have no control over. Some third party is breached, and either code is modified or an update is modified, and that's pushed down to you as a user. So I refer to these as a breach-based supply chain attack. Someone can say something like SolarWinds, for example, is the big one that kind of sparked the conversation in supply chain attacks. The second category of attacks that sometimes is forgotten about is this concept of a vulnerability that may exist in a dependency or a third-party library or SDK that's leveraged by a product. And this is really important. This is part of the software supply chain of that product. And if there's a vulnerability in that dependency, then you are also vulnerable to a supply chain attack. Maybe an example right here that is probably the most famous one is Log4j. Have you ever considered the fact that the vulnerability in Log4j was part of the software supply chain? All right, so keep that in mind, and what I'm going to do is move forward and kind of switch gears and talk a little bit about some vulnerabilities that I've discovered and some experiences that I've had that kind of lead to the methodology for helping to defend against supply chain attacks. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is several years ago, I think 4 or 5 years ago at this point, I got to work on a project of hacking a BBROM infusion pump. This was a lot of fun. I did this with a fellow researcher, Philippe Larhart, at the time. And we discovered 5 vulnerabilities that led to complete remote compromise of this device. We were actually able to administer drugs and change the drug features remotely to patients. I've done many presentations on this. If you want to look it up and get the nitty-gritty details, there's some cool stuff there. But what I want to bring your attention to for this specific talk is the initial compromise of this device hinged on one key aspect. So we're doing research to try to figure out how are we going to remotely break into this infusion pump. And for a while, this was a huge challenge. It was relatively an externally secure device. And we're doing open source intelligence. Keep this in mind. This is going to be very important for later in the presentation. So we're doing some open source intelligence, and we find this library on GitHub that's being used by the pump called the JSON dbus bridge. And we run across this commit message. Fix sending JSON containing % characters. Now, I think I have a few hackers in the room. Can anybody in the room shout out what that might scream or what that might say if you've done a little bit of hacking before? I think I heard it. What? Say it again? Vulnerability. Yeah. Anyone know what type of vulnerability? There it is, format string vulnerability. So sure enough, we look down in the commit and we see the replacement of a printf with puts. And what's happening is they're patching a format string vulnerability. A CVE was never created for this vulnerability, but it existed in this dependency. And sure enough, the Infusion pump did not have the most updated version of this library it was using and was vulnerable to this attack. So taking a step back outside the specifics of this scenario, what do we learn when it comes to supply chain attacks that's important? It's extremely important that you enumerate your dependencies. You have to have an understanding of what your products are using or what they're ingesting, because just because a vulnerability has been patched in the dependency doesn't mean that your product is using that version. Now let's keep that in mind as we move forward. Another example, I worked on a project of hacking the Delta Control IntelliBus Manager. It was also several years ago, and there's also presentations about this if you want to see the details of this hack. But the short version is I discovered a vulnerability that was in the BACnet protocol that this was using that allowed me to remotely completely take over this device. I was able to control what it was controlling. For example, we happen to be in a hotel. And these are very, very prevalent in hotel networks. They control the HVAC system. There's probably many of these in this building. And these were largely connected directly to the internet. So our attack scenario looks something like this, where a remote attacker over the internet could exploit that vulnerability and get on that device. But what's more interesting is outside of controlling the device specifically, as we did additional assessments, we found that a lot of times these were not isolated from other components of whether it be a hotel, casino, restaurant network. And so we could jump or use that to pivot to other things like the point of sale system or the surveillance network. So what does this mean, or what can we take away from this from a supply chain attack perspective? Ultimately, as a defender, we want to make sure that we isolate instead of trust what you don't understand. Or better yet, what if we actually understood the technology that we're using? And keep that in mind. We'll come back to that as well here in a few minutes. So lastly, from a stories perspective, I wanted to talk a little bit about the usage of technically older vulnerabilities. What you see on the screen here on the left-hand side is we have a vulnerability back from 2011 or 2010, 2011, probably one of the most famous, which is it was used in Stuxnet, and it had to do with the fact that there was hard-coded, credentials. And oftentimes we think like, oh, that was 15, 20 years ago. That's not today's attack surface. But ironically, as we continue to do assessments and do a product security test, what we find is that this is actually still a 2024 problem. And so here, using a tool like Rapid Risk Radar, we can look and see that, and when I put this presentation together maybe a couple weeks ago, this was just the top 4 vulnerabilities that came up that were related to hard-coded passwords. And they're still prevalent in today's attack landscape. So again, what can we take away from this? We can take away of the age of the threat is actually irrelevant. What attackers care about is whether it's usable or not. So we can have all of these new AI-powered mitigations, or we can have all these new defensive technologies, but if we keep having these type of vulnerabilities, then that's what the attackers are going to use. So let's think about this now. I'm going to take these 3 concepts or these 3 examples, and I'm going to start folding them into how we defend against supply chain attacks. Ultimately, one of the things that we talk about in Security 568 is this mindset of think red, act blue. And for the most part, many of you in this room may not even realize that you already practice this mindset because of the fact that you're here. you could take the same skills that you're using to do offensive security or vulnerability discovery or exploitation and do what the threat actors do, right? And you could use them to build ransomware, to attack other, to hostility attack other companies, but we're not doing that. What sets us apart is we think the same way. We think with that offensive mindset, but the differentiator is what we do with that. That's the Act Blue component. And one way that we do this is the concept of product security testing. So what is product security testing? The most simplistic definition that I could come up with is evaluating a product for new threats introduced to an organization. Evaluating a product for new threats introduced to an organization. It's a proactive security measure. So you see, every time we choose to use a new piece of software or we choose to use a new piece of hardware, our threat model changes or our risk profile changes. And we want to evaluate that in order to be able to properly defend our networks. So that's the what. How about the why? Why should we bother considering this? And eventually we'll get into the how and this supply chain attack nature. But I want you to think for a second about something not cybersecurity related. How many people in the room like coffee or drink coffee? Now, usually there's quite a few hands. There's a lot of hands in the room. I'm usually like the only one that does not like or drink coffee. I'm a tea drinker myself, can't stand the taste of coffee. But what's interesting is, can you answer the question, is coffee good for you? Is it healthy? Well, you get what's interesting about that, and I heard a lot of no's in the room here. What's interesting about that question is it's kind of as engineers or as security professionals, the answer is actually something that we all hate. It's not black or white. It's not 1 or 0. That's what we always want to hear. We want to say yes or no. But the answer is actually it depends. If you dig into whether or not coffee is healthy for you, it depends on a specific genotype that you may or may not have depending on your genetic makeup. So if you have this genotype, you metabolize caffeine quickly. And if that's the case, coffee is actually healthy for you, obviously within the appropriate quantities. And I'm not going to suggest whether or not we drink it in the right quantities or not, but coffee can be healthy for you. But if you don't have that genotype, then coffee is actually puts you at a higher risk for heart attack. So how do we determine whether or not coffee was good for you? Well, you have to do a DNA test. And that's exactly what product security testing is in the security world. It's a DNA test to understand how is this technology made up, and therefore, what are the risks associated with it, and what are the specific mitigations that I should put in place in order to defend against this technology. There's nothing wrong or nothing against industry best practice, but industry best practice is not going to be able specifically to combat things like software supply chain attacks. What the better way for us to do this is to understand the technology in which we're using, and then we can put targeted defenses in place. And product security testing is like that DNA test for our products. So looking at all of this and putting it together, we built out a methodology for executing product security testing. So you're going to see as you study this, as you walk into this, and we have, I love my flow charts. If you take 568, I think we provide you 15 or so flow charts. This is the overview flow chart for product security testing. In fact, we have a much cooler looking version that Sans put together as a poster that you can download as well on the website. I'm not that cool. I can't do graphics like that. So you get the draw.io version. And this is influenced by everything that I talked about at the beginning of the presentation. So thinking about dependencies, thinking about the fact that attackers like to use old threats, thinking about the fact that we have to isolate what we don't understand, but we have the potential to understand it so that we can properly mitigate these attacks. This is all built into this methodology. I don't have time to walk through this whole thing with you guys today. I think I have about 15 minutes left, and I do this in 5 days. But I'm going to give you some of the highlights quickly. So the first part, or the point that I want to point out, is this concept of online product research that we talk about, or OSINT. Remember that I said in the BBROM hack, that the only reason that we were able to get into that device is that we were doing online research and found a library that had a vulnerability that was then used within our product. And that's one of the proven things that shows it's very important to understand and be able to look online and do this type of research for your product and then the components of your product. This is here at the beginning of the flow chart, but it's actually integrated into every single green box that's on this design. The next core concept that I'm going to point out in this flow chart is the concept of basic enumeration. I've had the privilege of speaking almost all over the world on different hacking concepts, a lot of them a couple on the hacks that you saw earlier today. And in almost every presentation, somebody will ask me the question, if it's exploit focused or vulnerability focused, they'll say, how long did it take you to discover that vulnerability? How long did it take you to write that exploit? And what's interesting about the answer to that question is what I often tell people is about 75% of my time, somewhere between 75 and 80% of my time, has nothing to do with hacking. In fact, it even has very little to do with security. I have to put the time in to understand my target, to understand how it works. And I largely have to understand it at a deeper level than the average user. That's how you're going to discover those vulnerabilities. So what is that? That is what basic enumeration is. Basic enumeration is the concept of, I need to really understand how this works, and I'm going to use some automated tools to do that, so that way my output of basic enumeration is the generating of a threat model. And that threat model is going to guide the rest of your research. And this is critical if we're going to be able to successfully stop supply chain attacks, because we can't prevent what we don't understand. Now, sometimes basic enumeration is not enough, and we need to go to the next level. We have to do what I coin as deep enumeration. And this is going to could include all different types of processes, but the two that I like to highlight is deep network inspection or binary code analysis, or reverse engineering would be another way that you could think of it. Remember the Delta IntelliBus controller, when I said one of the discoveries was the vulnerability was in the BACnet protocol. BACnet's a weird protocol where part of it is a well-known protocol, part of it is defined, it has an RFC, but then there's also a developer component to it. There's a layer of it that is defined by the developer, and so part of it is also a proprietary protocol. Last year here at HackFest, I talked about a methodology to attack proprietary protocols, and that's part of what goes into deep enumeration, is understanding how those things work at a level so that, again, we can put in the proper defenses. And this also may include things like fuzzing, depending on how far you want to take this. And then lastly, we have to do the think blue component. So a lot of that is the think red component. What is that think blue component? How are we actually going to defend against supply chain attacks? We have to take all the data that we learned. We have to determine what the risks are, update our threat models, use things like attack trees, so that way we can eventually get to the point where we have implemented a more secure process. So that's an overview of taking information that we've observed over the years from a hacker's perspective, turning it into a methodology that we can use for testing our products with the hope and outcome of, how do I do better and improve our defenses against not just supply chain attacks, but all attacks in general. And you might be thinking to yourself, that's a really good academic process, but how would this actually apply in real life? Tell me how this would really work specifically to supply chain attacks. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to take 3 examples of supply chain attacks that have happened over the last 5 years or so, and I'm going to attempt to show you how this methodology would fit into those supply chain attacks. I'm going to start with the supply chain attack that potentially ruined a lot of people's Christmas in 2023. I don't know if you remember if you worked in a SOC, you probably definitely remember this, especially if you used the Barracuda technology. But there was this vulnerability that was released that was publicly exploited as well. in Barracuda firewalls, but it was actually not something directly related to those network devices. It was in a spreadsheet parser function. And I found it really interesting at the time that this was released, and the CVE was even filed technically against the Barracuda product, that there was very little conversation about that this was not specific to their devices. This was a software supply chain vulnerability. This was in a dependency that they leveraged. So what does that mean for everything else that I use in my organization? If we do just a little bit of research, we find that this library is used in products as large as Debian and Fedora is where this product is used. And so it's really important to understand where else am I vulnerable from this supply chain attack. Well, product security testing, if we have exercised it on our Barracuda product either before or after that we put it in for production, we would have at least known that this library is used. If we looked at other software that we've used within our environment, we would know that this library is used. And so when this vulnerability is released, we would be able to go back and help strengthen the rest of our network by understanding, hey, this product, this other software over here, we're running this Debian distro. It also has the vulnerable library on it. Maybe I should make sure that it's updated. Or does the proof of concept work against that Debian distro that we're using at this part of our organization? You wouldn't even know that was an issue by just looking at the publicly available information. And of course, there's also the chance that if you had done the appropriate testing on these firewalls or network devices before putting them into production, that maybe you would have actually discovered this vulnerability and reported it as well in the first place. Another example that I'll provide is the CodeCov attack. This was back in 2021. So the Barracuda one I talked about, that is the type of supply chain attack that exists in a third-party library or SDK. So now let's talk about what I would say is probably the more popular style of supply chain attack, that breach-based one, where you have no control over whether or not this attack is going to happen. And so in 2021, CodeCov experienced a breach, and as a result of that, customers of CodeCov started getting compromised due to this bash uploader script that they leveraged, or actually was optional to leverage within their environment. So depending on how large the picture is on the screen, I don't know if you can see, but the image is showing the first line or one of the top lines of that script. And it's using a technique called curl bashing. Curl bashing is when you curl something or sort of download something from the internet and you pipe it directly into bash. This is a really bad idea. It's a well-known really bad idea. Essentially what you're saying is that I'm going to trust the server that this code comes from and the code that's coming from it and immediately execute it without any type of verification. It's been known for a very long time to be a bad security practice. So how would product security testing have helped you in this supply chain attack instance? One of the things we talk about in deep enumeration is doing some reversing or code analysis. This is actually an open source script, which is way simpler than doing any type of reverse engineering. By doing product security testing and reviewing the components that you plan to use on your network, if you plan to use a script, you would have seen this almost immediately. And then what you can do as a result of that, you can take steps to say, one, we're not going to use this script because of this line here. Or two, it's an open source script. I'm going to modify it to add in some security checks to not use this proven techniques that's negative, which may have prevented you from being a victim of this attack. By the way, CodeCov has taken this script down. They do not allow it to be used with their stuff anymore, so it's no longer an issue. But it is a great example of how reviewing the code that you're going to use beforehand could help prevent you from being a victim of a software supply chain attack. My last example, as far as real-world application goes, is the Click Studios. Click Studios is a company that produces a product called Password State. It's a password manager, much like LastPass or Bitwarden you might be example with. One of their websites was compromised, and as a result, so again, we're talking about a breach-based supply chain attack. You can do nothing to prevent that organization from being breached, but you can do things on your side to help mitigate the effects of that. So for this instance, there was about a 28-hour period where an extra DLL was included in the update that was being pulled down for the password state. So doing product security testing, one of the things that we talk about is making sure that you understand what is supposed to be in that update package, and sometimes even where that update package is coming from. And so the addition of a completely new DLL, if you have put in the appropriate security rules in your products, things like EDRs or firewall solutions, and you would have seen that, hey, there's an extra DLL here. Maybe I won't deploy that right away before I have a chance to test it, because this is abnormal for this update package. Or maybe I'll at least hold it for 24 hours before I deploy it. And at that point, you would have seen that this was a malicious attack. So again, it's that concept of knowledge is power. We can't protect against what we don't know if we don't understand normal. So oftentimes I give a presentation like this, or I talk about this concept or talk about this methodology, and I'll ultimately get some people to like, hey, this sounds like, I get it, it's a really good idea. However, this sounds like something that is impossible for me to undertake in my organization. You know, maybe we use 1,000 products, maybe we use 10,000 products. How am I going to implement something of this technical level across that quantity of application? So what I want to talk now for the last few minutes that I have here on stage is talk about how do we go about deploying this in a reasonable effort or a reasonable frame of mind. The reality of it is we're not going to try to do this on every single application. And so I need to understand, how do I narrow my scope for the applications that are in my network? Well, when we're thinking about software supply chain attacks, CISA provides us some good guidelines on what is typically the target of software supply chain attacks. They boil it, there's a document you can go out there and read, but they boil it down to two main things. One is products that require privileged access, and two, that have frequent communication with a vendor's network. So products, for example, like a lot of your security products, AV products or EDR products that have higher level access and are constantly communicating back, are typically a good place to ensure that you're doing things like product security testing. But okay, that's still a lot of products. How do we continue to narrow our scope? Well, we can look at another regulatory organization, something like NIST, and NIST also provides a supply chain risk management process. They have 5 steps here, or 5 concepts here that they like to highlight on ways to help ensure manage your supply chain risk. What I want to do is point you to the first 2 of those. And so the first one is identifying your key mission. Basically, what is essential for you to do? What do you provide services for? What's making you money on a regular basis? Well, if we overlap that with what was on the last slide, and we talk about applications that have privileged access, that are communicating to vendors, that are also essential for business generating revenue, we start to shrink that size of applications and get a better picture of where should I get started. And the other point that it talks about here is documenting software and addressing software vulnerabilities that are existed in those products. And that's also a good place to pull in things like vulnerability intelligence. So I love our regulatory organizations. I think organizations like CISA and NIST, they provide a lot of really good process to get started, but they oftentimes lack the practical hands-on, how do I actually go about and do these things that you're talking about. So I want to leave you here today with just a few tangible technology, hands-on ways to start identifying what these applications are within your network. The first thing I'll talk about is in identifying or prioritizing your critical assets, tools like Pingcastle. I don't know if anyone is familiar with Pingcastle. I know they talk about it in Security 599 and a few other classes as well. But it's basically the blue team version of Bloodhound. And it's really good at identifying where you have those privileged accounts on your network, also identifying where you might have implicit trust or Active Directory anomalies that you might not realize you have in your organization. And it's a great place to start enumerating, okay, these are the critical high privileged applications. You can combine that with what we call as flow data, basically network data, using tools like Zeek to look for how your data is flowing in and out of your network. excuse me, and looking for sensitive information within that data, using things like DNS, next generation firewall logs, excuse me, all can help you identify sensitive information or where your information is flowing, what products are beaconing out that also have implicit trust. Again, trying to narrow that scope of applications to get started with. And lastly, using threat intelligence tool or vulnerability intelligence tools, things like Rapid Risk Radar, which can give you that intelligence on what the vulnerabilities, the latest vulnerabilities that are and how they map to your products, can be extremely useful as well. Well, I don't want to get in the way of anybody in lunch much longer, so I thank you for listening to me for a few minutes. Happy to take any questions live, Steve, that you might have. And again, feel free to reach out to me at any time. Thank you.